Picture this. It is January 1887. The temperature in northern Wisconsin has not climbed above zero in 11 days. The pine forests stretch out in every direction. Millions of board feet of white pine standing in timber so thick you cannot see 50 yards in front of you. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, a road runs straight through the wilderness. Not a dirt road, not a gravel road, a road made entirely of ice. It is 14 feet wide, polished smooth as glass, and it stretches for over 100 miles through terrain so rugged that no wagon could survive it in summer. Massive sleighs loaded with 12,000 pounds of fresh-cut timber glide down this road, pulled by teams of draft horses whose hooves are fitted with sharp iron calks to keep them from slipping. The runners on these sleighs have been coated in a thin layer of ice themselves, and when they move, they make a sound like a low whistle cutting through the frozen air. You can hear the teamster shouting commands. You can hear the chains rattling. You can hear the creak of wood under impossible weight. And if you listen closely, you can hear the ice itself groaning and popping underneath everything, reminding every man on that road that the highway beneath their feet is temporary. That, come April, this road will not exist. It will be a river again, or a swamp, or a stretch of mud so deep it swallows wagon wheels whole. But right now, in the dead of winter, this frozen river is the most important piece of infrastructure in the American economy, because without it, those trees are worthless. They are just standing timber in the middle of nowhere, and with it, they become lumber. They become houses and railroad ties and ship masts and the raw material of a nation that is expanding westward faster than anyone thought possible. This is the story of how America turned frozen rivers and lakes into 100-mile highways, how an army of forgotten workers built and maintained these ice roads in conditions that would kill most people, and how entire forests were moved across the surface of frozen water in one of the most ambitious and dangerous transportation systems ever devised. Before we get into the ice roads themselves, you need to understand the problem they were built to solve. Because nobody wakes up one morning and says, "I think I will build a highway out of frozen water." That is an act of desperation. And the desperation was real. In the second half of the 1800s, America was consuming lumber at a rate the world had never seen. The country was building everything all at once. Railroads were stretching across the continent, and every mile of track needed 2,500 wooden ties. Cities were exploding in population, and every new building needed framing lumber, floor joists, roof trusses, siding, and trim. The Great Fire of Chicago in 1871 destroyed over 17,000 structures in a single night, and every one of them had to be rebuilt with wood. The Great Fire of Peshtigo, which happened on the exact same night and killed over 1,500 people in Wisconsin, created even more demand. America was burning wood and building with wood simultaneously, and the appetite was bottomless. The supply was standing in the forests of Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Maine. Billions of board feet of white pine, the preferred building timber of the era. White pine was light, straight-grained, easy to work, and grew in enormous stands that stretched for hundreds of miles. It was the perfect building material, and it was in the worst possible locations. These forests were remote. We are talking hundreds of miles from the nearest sawmill or railhead, deep in wilderness where no roads existed because nobody had ever needed roads there before. The terrain was brutal. Thick forest with blowdowns and underbrush so dense you had to chop your way through it. Rocky ground that could snap a wagon axle, river valleys with banks too steep for teams, and swamps, endless swamps that stretched for miles in every direction, filled with black water and muck that could swallow a man to his waist. In the summer months, this landscape was functionally impassable for heavy transport. The ground was a soup of mud and standing water. Mosquitoes and black flies came in clouds thick enough to drive horses mad and cause genuine suffering in men who had to work through them. Wagons sank to their axles on what passed for trails. Horses broke legs in hidden holes and stumps. The heat bred disease. Moving heavy timber through this landscape in warm weather was not just difficult, it was effectively impossible at any scale that mattered commercially. But then winter came. And winter changed everything. When the temperature dropped below freezing and stayed there for weeks, the landscape underwent a transformation so complete it was almost magical. The swamps froze solid. The mud hardened into something stronger than stone. Rivers stopped flowing and became flat, smooth surfaces capable of bearing enormous weight. Lakes that were barriers in summer became open plains of ice. Suddenly, the same terrain that was impassable in July became a natural highway system. Thousands of miles of frozen waterways connecting the deep timber stands to the sawmills and railheads, where the lumber could be processed and shipped to a nation that was screaming for more. The loggers figured this out early. By the 1840s in Maine and the 1850s in the Great Lakes states, the entire logging industry was organized around winter. You cut timber in the cold months, you hauled it on frozen ground, and you stacked it on riverbanks to wait for the spring thaw, when the rivers would carry it downstream to the mills. The cutting season was winter. The hauling season was winter. The building season was summer. Everything depended on the freeze. But here is the thing. A frozen river is not automatically a road, not even close. A river freezes in uneven patches. It develops pressure ridges where ice plates collide, creating walls of broken ice that can rise 3 or 4 feet above the surface. It has thin spots over springs and fast-moving currents where the water never quite freezes solid. Snowdrifts pile up in unpredictable mounds. Air pockets form beneath the surface, creating hollow spots that look solid but will collapse under weight. A frozen lake might be smooth near the shore and rough as broken concrete a quarter-mile out. If you just pointed a team of horses at a frozen river and told them to walk, you would lose the horses, the sleigh, the timber, and probably the teamster within the first mile. To turn frozen water into a functional highway, you needed engineering. You needed labor. You needed an entire system built from scratch every single year. And that is exactly what the lumber companies built. The construction of an ice road was one of the most labor-intensive operations in the entire logging industry, and it started weeks before the first load of timber ever touched the surface. Road crews would head out in late November or early December, as soon as the ice was thick enough to walk on safely, and begin the process of transforming raw frozen landscape into a usable transportation corridor. The first job was routing. A road boss, usually a veteran logger with decades of experience reading ice and terrain, would walk the proposed route on foot. Sometimes he covered 20 or 30 miles in a single day, alone, and in temperatures that could kill him if he turned an ankle and could not walk. He carried an ice auger, a long-handled tool with a cutting bit on the end, and he bored test holes every few hundred feet, measuring the thickness of the ice and noting the quality. Good ice was clear and blue. Bad ice was white and opaque, full of air bubbles that weakened its structure. He was looking for a minimum of 12 inches of solid blue ice for a loaded sleigh, though most operations preferred 18 inches or more before they would commit to a route. He marked thin spots with stakes. He noted where underground springs might weaken the surface throughout the winter. He flagged areas where the ice had formed over deep water versus shallow ground, because deep water ice behaves differently under load. He identified hills and grades that would need special treatment for loaded sleighs coming down. On every decision he made would determine whether men and horses lived or died over the coming months. A miscalculation of 2 inches of ice thickness was the difference between a highway and a grave. Once the route was set, the clearing crews moved in. They shoveled snow off the ice surface, sometimes for miles and miles, creating a corridor 14 to 16 feet wide. This was backbreaking, hand-done labor, performed with wooden shovels and raw determination. Dozens of men working in temperatures that frequently hit 20 or 30 below zero, clearing snow down to bare ice so the sleigh runners would have a smooth surface to glide on. In heavy snow years, when 4 or 5 feet accumulated, this alone could take weeks, and the snow never stopped coming. After every storm, the clearing crews went out again. Some operations used horse-drawn snow scrapers, V-shaped wooden plows that teams of horses dragged along the road to push snow to the sides. And these were an improvement over hand shoveling, but they could not handle deep drifts, and they left a rough surface that still needed finishing work. The final surface preparation was always done by hand and by water, which brings us to the most ingenious part of the whole system, the sprinkling crews. A loaded timber sleigh needed more than just clear ice to move efficiently. It needed a specific kind of ice surface, one that was hard, smooth, uniform, and consistent over the entire length of the road. Natural ice rarely provided this. It was bumpy, scratched from previous loads, chipped and cracked from temperature changes. The lumber companies solved this problem by building enormous tank sleighs. These were massive wooden tanks, built like barrels on their sides, mounted on heavy runners that held between 200 and 500 gallons of water. These tank sleighs were pulled up and down the ice road by horse teams in the middle of the night, when temperatures were at their lowest, spraying water onto the surface through a series of valves and perforated pipes mounted at the rear. The water would freeze almost instantly, creating a fresh layer of smooth, hard ice over whatever roughness or damage existed from the previous day's hauling. A well-sprinkled road had a surface like polished glass. The friction between the sleigh runners and this surface was so low that a two-horse team could pull loads that would require 8 or 10 horses on a dry winter road. The best ice roads were sprinkled every single night without exception. The sprinkling crews worked from around midnight until dawn, making multiple passes over the entire length of the road. And by the time the hauling crews arrived at first light, the surface was perfect. Now think about what this actually meant in practice. These men were working in the darkest, coldest hours of the night, in remote wilderness miles from any shelter, driving horse-drawn tank sleighs over frozen rivers and lakes, in temperatures that routinely drop to 30 and 40 below zero. At those temperatures, exposed skin freezes in minutes. Metal burns on contact. Your breath freezes into ice crystals before it leaves your face. The horse's breath would coat their muzzles and eyelashes in thick frost. The water in the tank would sometimes start to freeze if the crew moved too slowly between fills, and they would have to stop and build fires under the tank to thaw the valves. If a horse slipped and went down on the ice, the crew had to get the animal back on its feet before its body heat melted a depression in the surface and the horse became trapped. The sprinkling crews were considered some of the toughest workers in the lumber camps, and these were camps full of tough men. Until the sprinklers slept during the day while the rest of the camp worked, and they worked all night while everyone else slept. Their schedules made them ghosts in the camp, rarely seen by the day crews, but universally respected. Because every man in that camp knew that the roads they drove on existed because someone spent the night in the freezing dark with a water tank and a team of horses. And these roads were not short stretches. In Wisconsin and Minnesota, ice roads routinely stretched 40, 60, even over 100 miles through the wilderness. The Menominee River system in Michigan had ice road networks that connected dozens of logging camps to central banking grounds where timber was stacked for the Spring River Drive. In Minnesota, operations ran ice roads across the surfaces of entire lake chains, crossing from one frozen lake to the next, with short overland portages on frozen ground between them, creating transportation corridors that extended from deep in the interior all the way to the Mississippi River system. On these roads, the loads were staggering. A standard logging sleigh in the 1880s carried between 8,000 and 12,000 pounds of timber. But the lumber companies were always pushing for more, always trying to move more wood per trip, per horse, per dollar. They widened the bunks on the sleighs, stacked the logs higher, and bred larger and larger draft horses to pull them. The horses themselves were engineering achievements. Percherons, Belgians, and Clydesdales, weighing between 1,800 and 2,200 pounds each, bred specifically for the strength and temperament needed to haul heavy loads on ice. A good team of logging horses was worth more than most of the men who drove them, and the companies knew it. By the 1890s, some operations in Wisconsin were loading sleighs with over 30,000 pounds of timber on a single haul. There are photographs from this era that look physically impossible. Sleighs stacked with white pine logs, 15 feet high, the whole pyramid lashed together with chains, pulled by teams of 4 or 6 massive draft horses down ice roads that gleamed like silver in the winter sun. These loads were so heavy that if a runner broke or a chain snapped, the resulting collapse could kill everything within 20 feet. The teamsters who drove these loads were considered the elite of the logging workforce, and they earned it. A good teamster could read ice conditions by the sound his runners made against the surface, knowing instinctively whether the ice was getting soft, whether air pockets were forming, or whether pressure ridges were developing ahead. He could feel through the reins whether his horses were struggling for traction, and he could modulate the speed of a loaded sleigh on a downhill grade using nothing but voice commands and a hay brake, which was essentially a heavy chain wrapped around the runner that the teamster could tighten or loosen to control the rate of descent. The teamster sat on top of this moving mountain of timber, sometimes 15 feet above the ice surface, exposed to every gust of wind, with no protection from the cold and no safety equipment of any kind. If something went wrong, his only option was to jump and hope he landed clear of the logs. On a good day, on a well-maintained ice road with a good team and a balanced load, the work was almost beautiful. The sleigh would glide along with a hissing whisper, the horses breathing rhythmically, the timber shifting slightly with each undulation in the surface. A teamster could cover the distance from a remote cutting site to a banking ground in a single haul, so delivering 10 or 15,000 pounds of lumber to the riverbank and returning empty for another load before dark. On a bad day, the ice roads could kill you in a dozen different ways. The most feared danger was the runaway. On any road that crossed uneven terrain, and almost all of them did, there were hills. Even modest grades became deadly when you factored in the weight of a loaded sleigh and the near frictionless surface of well-sprinkled ice. If the hay brake failed, it's if the ice was too slick for the brake chain to grip. If a link in the chain snapped, the loaded sleigh would begin to accelerate down the grade. The horses, feeling the enormous weight pushing them from behind, would try to outrun it. But a loaded sleigh on ice builds speed faster than any team of horses can run. What happened next depended on the terrain. On a straight road, the sleigh might simply overtake the horses, crushing them under the runners. On a curve, the load would shift. The sleigh would overturn, and logs weighing hundreds of pounds each would scatter across the ice like enormous wooden projectiles. In some of the worst recorded incidents, runaway sleighs hit other teams coming the opposite direction on narrow roads, killing horses, men, and destroying thousands of dollars worth of timber in seconds of chaos. The lumber companies tried to engineer solutions. They built sand hills at the tops of steep grades, and where crews spread sand or hay on the ice to give the runners friction before the descent began. They built snub lines, heavy cables anchored to stumps at the top of a hill that could be wrapped around the rear of a sleigh to lower it slowly, like a rappelling line for timber. Some operations carved ruts into the ice at the top of hills, deep channels that the runners would drop into, slowing the sleigh through friction against the ice walls. But none of these measures were foolproof. The ice was always changing. What was safe at 6 in the morning might be lethal by noon if the sun warmed the surface even a few degrees. Then there was the ice itself. A frozen river is not a static object. It is a living, moving, breathing thing. It expands and contracts with temperature changes, and these movements create pressure ridges, walls of broken ice that can rise 3 or 4 feet above the surface and block a road overnight. Springs beneath the riverbed can create thin spots that look identical to the surrounding ice until a horse steps on them and the surface gives way. In the early season and the late season, when ice thickness was marginal, teams broke through with horrifying regularity. A horse that went through the ice was usually a dead horse. The water beneath was near freezing, the edges of the broken ice were sharp and treacherous, and a panicked draft horse weighing a ton cannot pull itself out of a hole in the ice. If the horse was still harnessed to a loaded sleigh, the weight of the timber would pull everything down into the water within seconds. Teamsters carried axes on their belts specifically for this situation, to cut the harness traces and free the surviving horses before the sleigh dragged them under. Sometimes they saved the horses. Sometimes they watched helplessly as animals they had worked with all season disappeared beneath the black water. Men went through too. Not as often as horses, but often enough that every veteran logger knew someone who had gone in and not come back out. The protocol for a man through the ice was simple because there was no time for anything complicated. You had maybe 2 minutes. Not because of drowning necessarily, but because of the cold. On a water at 32 degrees shuts your muscles down fast. Your hands stop working. Your legs stop kicking. Your breathing becomes uncontrollable. If your crew could get a rope or a long pole to you within those first 2 minutes, you had a fighting chance. After that, the cold owned you. And even if you got pulled out alive, you were not safe. There was no warming up on the ice road. The nearest heated building might be 5 or 10 miles away. Wet clothing in air that was 30 below zero freezes solid against your body within minutes. The walk back to camp in frozen clothing was its own death sentence. More than a few men were pulled from the water alive, only to die of exposure before they could reach shelter. The company records, where they exist, record these deaths with brutal brevity: name, date, cause, drowned, frozen, crushed. Beyond the rivers and the road systems, the lumber companies also used frozen lakes as staging grounds and transportation corridors on a scale that is hard to comprehend today. The great frozen lakes of Minnesota and Wisconsin became, for a few months each winter, the busiest highways in their states. Tens of thousands of cords of timber were hauled across their surfaces and stacked in enormous formations called rollways on the downriver shores, positioned on the banks of the streams and rivers that would carry the logs to sawmills when the ice broke up in spring. Some of these lake crossings were long. Teams hauled timber across Lake Winnebago in Wisconsin, which stretches 30 miles north to south. They crossed Mille Lacs Lake in Minnesota, which covers over 200 square miles of surface area. They routinely drove loaded sleighs across bays and inlets of Lake Superior itself, cutting miles off overland routes by simply driving straight across the frozen surface of the largest freshwater lake on Earth. The logistics of these crossings were serious. Road crews had to scout every crossing route before the hauling began, boring test holes and checking ice thickness at hundreds of points across the lake surface. They marked the safe route with small evergreen trees, cut and jammed into holes chopped in the ice, and creating a visible trail that teamsters could follow even in blowing snow and whiteout conditions. They checked ice constantly because lake ice is far less uniform than river ice. Wind pushes the ice around. Underwater currents create warm spots. Varying depths mean varying ice thickness. A crossing that was safe on Monday could have a new thin spot by Wednesday. On the biggest lake crossings, the lumber companies maintained way stations directly on the ice. Small log shanties or canvas-covered shelters set up at intervals along the route where teamsters could warm up at a stove, feed and rest their horses, and wait out sudden storms. These were built knowing they would be at the bottom of the lake by May. But for the months they stood, they were critical infrastructure. A man caught in a whiteout on a frozen lake miles from any shore with no shelter and the temperature falling was as good as dead. The scale of timber moved across these frozen surfaces was enormous. In a single winter season, a well-organized operation could move tens of millions of board feet across a single ice road network or lake crossing route. At the peak of the white pine era in the 1880s and 1890s, the lumber operations of the Great Lakes states were the largest industry in the region, and they supplied a significant portion of the entire nation's building material. Virtually all of that timber, or every single board foot of it, moved across ice at some point between the stump and the sawmill. The ice roads were not a supplement to the transportation system. They were the transportation system. This entire empire depended on one thing: the cold. The loggers needed the freeze to come early, stay hard, and last long. A warm spell in January could soften the roads, halt hauling operations for days or weeks, and cost a lumber company thousands of dollars in lost production and spoiled ice. A late freeze in November meant a shorter hauling season and less timber moved before the thaw. An early breakup in March could strand loaded sleighs on roads that were turning to slush, and strand millions of board feet of timber in the woods where it would sit, deteriorating until the following winter. The lumber companies watched the weather with an intensity that bordered on religious devotion. Road bosses kept daily temperature logs in small pocket notebooks. They tracked snowfall amounts as wind direction, sky conditions. They knew from decades of accumulated experience that a clear, still night meant the best conditions for the sprinkling crews, that a south wind meant warming and soft ice, that a ring around the moon meant snow was coming. The entire rhythm of the logging season, the livelihoods of thousands of men, the fortunes of the timber barons, all of it was dictated by the thermometer. And then every year, the thaw arrived. And when it came, the ice roads did not gradually deteriorate. They ceased to exist. The highway that had carried millions of pounds of timber simply vanished, and the landscape returned to the impassable tangle of water, mud, and forest it had been before the freeze. Rivers that had been polished roads became raging torrents of snowmelt carrying house-sized chunks of broken ice. Lakes that had supported the weight of loaded sleighs became open water. The ground that had been frozen hard as pavement became bottomless mud that could swallow a man to his thighs. This was the transition point that launched the second great act of the logging transportation system, the river drive. All winter long, the timber had been hauled to banking grounds along the edges of rivers and streams. Enormous rollways, sometimes piled 30 or 40 feet high and stretching for hundreds of yards along the bank. She stood waiting for the moment the ice went out and the water rose with snowmelt. When it did, the rivermen moved in with their peavies and their cant hooks and began rolling the logs into the swollen current. The river drive was the other half of the equation. What the ice road started, the rivers finished. Hundreds of thousands of logs were pushed into the rushing spring water and driven downstream to the sawmills, sometimes traveling 100 miles or more over weeks of constant work. The rivermen who guided these drives are legendary in American labor history, and deservedly so. They walked on spinning, bucking logs in frigid, fast-moving water, using nothing but caulked boots and balance, breaking up jams that could stack logs 30 feet high across the entire width of a river. When a jam let go, the wall of timber that came downstream moved with the force of an avalanche. Men died on the river drives every single spring. But the river drive could not have happened without the ice roads. The two systems were one system. The roads moved the timber from the stump to the river. The river moved the timber from the wilderness to the mill. Take away either half, and the whole infrastructure collapsed. The ice road was not a footnote. It was the foundation. It is worth pausing here to think about the men who made all of this possible. Because the ice roads were not built by machines. There were no bulldozers, no snowplows, no heated cabs. Every foot of every ice road, every year, was built and maintained by human muscle and horsepower, in conditions that most people alive today cannot truly imagine. The logging camps of the ice road era were rough places. Men slept in bunkhouses that held anywhere from 20 to 80 workers, packed shoulder to shoulder in double-tiered wooden bunks with straw-filled mattresses that were rarely changed. A single cast iron stove in the center of the room kept the temperature somewhere above freezing, but just barely. Clothing that was soaked with sweat during the day was hung on lines near the stove to dry overnight, filling the bunkhouse with a thick, sour fog of steam and body odor that veterans said you never got used to. They woke in darkness, 4:30 in the morning, sometimes earlier, roused by the cook's assistant banging on a cast iron triangle outside the bunkhouse door. They ate before dawn in a cookhouse that was the only truly warm building in camp. Salt pork fried in its own grease, beans that had been simmering since the night before, thick slabs of bread with molasses, and black coffee so strong it could strip paint off a barn wall. A man might consume 4,000 or 5,000 calories a day and still lose weight, because the cold burned through energy the way a furnace burns through cordwood. They were on the ice by first light and worked until dark, which in a northern winter meant only 8 or 9 hours of useful daylight. They ate again, a second massive meal of whatever the cook had managed to produce. They collapsed into their bunks. They did it again the next morning, and the next, and the next. 6 days a week, every week, from November through March. Sunday was the only day off, and most men spent it sleeping, mending clothing, and sharpening tools. The pay was modest. A common laborer in a Great Lakes logging camp in the 1880s made between $20 and $30 a month, with food and shelter provided. Teamsters, who commanded higher skill and bore greater responsibility, might earn $40 or $50 a month. A road boss, the man responsible for the entire ice road system and the lives of every man who traveled it, earned perhaps $60 or $70. These were not wages that made men wealthy. They were survival wages, unearned in conditions that shortened lives and broke bodies. Injuries were constant. Medical care was a man in camp who had a box of bandages and a bottle of whiskey. A broken bone meant a rough splint and a sleigh ride to the nearest town, which might take 2 days. Frostbite was so common it barely warranted mention. Missing fingers, missing toes, blackened ears and noses. These were just the marks of a man who worked the ice roads. The more catastrophic injuries, the crushings from runaway loads, the drownings through thin ice, the horses rolling over on their drivers, those ended careers or ended lives. There was no workers' compensation, no disability payments, no lawsuits. If you got hurt, you either healed up and went back to work, or you did not. These men are almost completely forgotten now. You will not find monuments to the sprinkling crews who built ice roads at midnight. There are no national holidays honoring the road bosses who walked frozen rivers with an auger and their own judgment. The lumber barons whose fortunes rose from this brutal system built mansions that still stand in cities like Minneapolis, St. Paul, Grand Rapids, Saginaw, and Bangor. Their names are on libraries and parks and university buildings. The men who built and drove the ice roads left behind almost nothing. No houses, no savings, no memorials. And just the timber they moved and the stories they told their grandchildren before those stories too began to fade. The ice road era began to decline in the 1890s and was largely finished by the 1920s. Several forces combined to end it. Railroads expanded deeper into timber country, building spur lines that could reach logging operations year-round, eliminating the need for winter-only sleigh hauling on some routes. The invention of the steam log hauler, it's a massive track machine that could pull multiple loaded sleighs, made ice roads more efficient, but also made them less necessary, as the machines could travel on packed snow roads that did not require the elaborate sprinkling and maintenance of true ice roads. Gasoline-powered trucks arrived by the 1910s and 1920s, and with them came the ability to haul timber in any season on roads that could be maintained with new equipment. But the most fundamental reason the ice roads disappeared was that the timber disappeared first. The great white pine forests of the Great Lakes states, forests that had seemed limitless and eternal to the first loggers who cut into them, were being consumed at a rate that staggered even the men doing the cutting. By 1900, Michigan's white pine was largely gone. Wisconsin's was going fast. Minnesota's would be stripped within 2 decades. The lumber companies moved west, up into the Douglas fir forests of Oregon, the redwoods of California, the spruce and cedar of Washington, where different terrain and milder climates demanded entirely different methods. The ice road, that astonishing invention born of necessity and maintained by extraordinary human effort, became a relic of a vanished world. But here is what stays with me about this story. For roughly 50 years, from the 1850s through the early 1900s, the American economy depended on frozen water, not as a curiosity, not as a regional novelty, as critical national infrastructure. The ice roads of the Great Lakes logging era moved more timber than any railroad of their time could match. They connected deep wilderness to civilization across distances and terrain that defeated every other form of transportation. They were engineered with sophisticated understanding of ice behavior, temperature dynamics, and load mechanics. They were maintained nightly with a dedication that would shame most modern road crews. And they were operated at tremendous human cost by men who understood exactly what they were risking every time they stepped onto the ice. The frozen rivers of America were not just makeshift trails. They were proof of something that runs deep in the character of the people who built this country. When the landscape says no, when the terrain itself is designed to stop you, when every rational calculation says this cannot work, there will always be someone who looks at a frozen river and sees a road, someone willing to bet their life that the ice will hold. Someone who loads another 15,000 pounds of white pine onto a sleigh and drives it into the frozen darkness, trusting the road, trusting the horses, trusting a highway that will be gone by spring. It did not always hold. Men died. Horses died. Whole loads vanished through the ice into water so cold it stopped a man's heart before he could scream. But they drove it anyway. Morning after morning, winter after winter, decade after decade. And the lumber that built the houses your grandparents grew up in, the railroad ties that stitched a continent together, the ships that carried American goods across oceans, all of it traveled, at some point in its journey from forest to finished product, across a highway made of frozen water. A road that existed only in winter, a road that had to be rebuilt from nothing every single year, a road that vanished every spring without leaving a trace. That is what America was built on. Not just timber and steel and ambition, but ice and darkness and the calloused hands of men whose names nobody remembers. The frozen rivers are flowing now. The ice roads are gone. The forests they stripped are growing back, slowly, in second and third growth that will never match what was there before. But the country those men helped build is still standing, and it owes a debt to those forgotten workers on the ice that it has never acknowledged and will probably never repay. If you made it this far, you are not a casual viewer. You are the kind of person who wants to know what this country actually cost to build. Subscribe, because every week we go back into the forgotten labor and lost infrastructure that made America possible. And if you want another story about men who moved the unmovable in conditions that should have stopped them, click the video on screen now. I will see you there.